I clearly cut all my hair off because everyone was sick of dealing with it.
It was the year 2000. Meg Ryan had just stepped out of the golden decade of the 1990s, a period when her name was nearly interchangeable with the genre itself. She was America's sweetheart, the face and heart of romantic comedies that defined a generation. When Harry Met Sally, Sleepless in Seattle, You've Got Mail, her smile was described as the one that could melt the ice off a New York winter, and studios lined up to cast her. Then, almost overnight, she was gone. No more red carpets, no more box office topping roles, no more studio bidding wars. The easy explanation was that she had aged out of the Hollywood system, or that a few underperforming films had damaged her box office draw. But the truth was far more tangled, a mix of personal upheaval, industry politics, and a scandal that the media only told half the truth about. The first truth, rarely told. In 2001, when news broke that Meg Ryan and Dennis Quaid were divorcing, the tabloids moved fast. The story was packaged neatly. She had been unfaithful, involved in a brief but very public romance with Russell Crowe during the filming of Proof of Life. It was an easy narrative for headlines, but according to a former member of that film's crew, it wasn't the affair that ended the marriage, it was the final chapter in a much longer private struggle. For years, Meg had endured Dennis's repeated infidelities, quietly protecting his image in public. In 2008, she would hint at the truth in an interview. The truth is always more complicated than the story people want to hear. The second truth, almost entirely unknown. After stepping away from the public eye, Meg spent nearly a year living in a remote village in Provence, France. She rented a small stone house on a quiet hill, learned pottery, painted in the afternoons, and went to the market each morning for bread and fresh flowers. She had no entourage, no paparazzi, and no connection to the Hollywood machine. The villagers knew her simply as Meg, a polite woman with an easy laugh, not the actress who once ruled the box office. Meg Ryan's story isn't just about stardom, it's about escape. And to understand why she walked away from everything at the very top, we need to start much earlier. We need to go back to the roots, to the contradictions of her childhood, the quiet determination that propelled her into acting, and the decisions that made her both Hollywood's most bankable star and eventually one of its most famous disappearances. Sometimes, to find yourself again, you have to vanish from the world entirely. Meg Ryan was not born Meg Ryan. She came into the world on November 19, 1961, in Fairfield, Connecticut, as Margaret Mary Emily Ann Hyra, a name as long and layered as the childhood she was about to navigate. Her early life was not the picture-perfect prologue you might expect for someone destined to become America's sweetheart. Meg grew up in a family that looked, from the outside, like the suburban ideal. A teacher mother, an advertising executive father, 3 children in a quiet neighborhood. But behind the front door, the cracks were already forming. Her parents' marriage was strained for much of her childhood, a tension Meg absorbed without fully understanding it. When she was 15, they divorced. The separation was a turning point, not only because it fractured her family, but because it forced Meg into a role she hadn't planned on. The self-reliant observer. She became skilled at reading people, at adapting her own presence to fit the room, at hiding her own feelings behind expressions that made others comfortable. Later, she would admit that acting was, in many ways, an extension of this survival skill. After the divorce, Meg lived primarily with her mother Susan, who encouraged her creativity but also carried her own unfulfilled ambitions. Susan had once dreamed of being an actress herself, but instead became a high school drama teacher. She recognized Meg's charisma early, but she was also critical, sometimes pushing her daughter toward perfection rather than self-expression. Her father, Harry, had a different influence. His work in advertising exposed her to the idea of presentation, how stories are packaged and sold, how image can be crafted to fit a need. It was a lesson Meg would carry into her own career, both as a strength and, eventually, a burden. In high school, Meg was not the cheerleader or the prom queen. She was the girl people liked to talk to, bright, funny, approachable. She had a sharp intelligence and a quick wit, both of which made her a natural on stage, though at the time she had no clear plan to pursue acting seriously. After graduating in 1979, she enrolled at the University of Connecticut and later transferred to NYU to study journalism. It was a practical choice. Journalism promised a career, stability, and a chance to tell stories. But while at NYU, something unexpected happened. To make extra money, she began auditioning for commercials. She booked them quickly. Her fresh, open look and natural ease on camera made her stand out. Soon she was appearing in a series of TV spots, her face becoming quietly familiar to audiences who didn't yet know her name. One of her first significant breaks came in 1981, when she landed a recurring role on the daytime soap opera As the World Turns. It was meant to be temporary, but Meg brought a warmth and relatability to her role as Betsy Stewart Montgomery that caught the attention of casting directors. She learned the grind of television production: long hours, quick script changes, emotional scenes on command. It was a crash course in the discipline of acting. At the same time, she was still attending classes at NYU, juggling scripts and schoolwork, playing two very different roles: aspiring journalist by day, working actress by, well, also by day, but on a set instead of in a classroom. Eventually, acting began to pull her more strongly than journalism. She could see a path forming, even if it wasn't the one she'd envisioned when she first left home. Her early film roles were small, but strategic. In 1986, she appeared in Top Gun as Carol Bradshaw, the charming wife of Goose, played by Anthony Edwards. The part was brief, but her warmth and wit made her memorable. Hollywood noticed. It was also on Top Gun that she saw, up close, how a blockbuster was made. The machine of it, the marketing, the way it turned actors into icons. By the late 1980s, Meg was on the cusp of something big. She had the talent, the look, and the adaptability. What she didn't have yet was the role that would launch her into the stratosphere. That role would arrive in 1989 in a film about two friends who argued about love over the course of 12 years, culminating in one of the most famous scenes in romantic comedy history. But before that, Meg Ryan was still just Margaret Hyra from Connecticut, the journalism student who stumbled into acting, carrying with her the lessons of a fractured home, a sharp sense of observation, and a growing understanding that Hollywood was not just about telling stories. It was about knowing how to play a part, both on screen and off. By 1989, Meg Ryan had built a respectable career. Steady television work, a handful of small but memorable film roles, and the kind of presence casting directors remembered. But nothing had prepared her for what came next. It began with a script from writer Nora Ephron and director Rob Reiner. A sharp, funny, deceptively simple story about friendship, love, and the messy space in between. The project was When Harry Met Sally. The role of Sally Albright was not written specifically for Meg, but from the first audition, it was clear she was Sally. Smart, endearing, a little neurotic, and utterly believable. The film was a slow-burn cultural phenomenon. It didn't just succeed, it embedded itself in American pop culture. The famous "I'll have what she's having" diner scene became a shorthand for playful female boldness, endlessly quoted and parodied. For Meg, it was more than a breakout. It was a coronation. She had found her niche, romantic comedy, but with intelligence and authenticity that elevated the genre. Through the early 1990s,
Meg Ryan became Hollywood's most bankable female lead. She headlined Sleepless in Seattle, 1993, reuniting with Nora Ephron and pairing for the first time with Tom Hanks. The film was a transcontinental love story told through letters and radio calls, a gamble in structure that paid off spectacularly. Audiences were enchanted. Then came You've Got Mail, 1998, another Ephron-Hanks collaboration that tapped into the novelty of the internet era. Meg's portrayal of Kathleen Kelly, a small bookstore owner in love with her anonymous online pen pal, was both timeless and of the moment. The film grossed over $250 million worldwide and cemented her as the era's romantic lead of choice. What set Meg apart was not just her charm, but her ability to make romance feel grounded. She was approachable, relatable, the kind of star women wanted as a best friend and men believed they could fall in love with. She didn't play perfection, she played sincerity. And sincerity sold. Off-screen, however, Meg was beginning to feel the weight of that image. In interviews, she hinted at a growing discomfort with being boxed in.
I never wanted to be a poster girl for romance. I wanted to be an actress who could do many things. Hollywood, however, had found its formula. And in that formula, there was little room for deviation. When Meg tried to branch out into more dramatic roles, such as in Courage Under Fire, 1996, or City of Angels, 1998, the results were mixed. Critics often praised her, but the box office reinforced the studio belief that audiences only wanted her in rom-coms. By the late 90s, her career was both at its peak and in a precarious position. Every film she led was scrutinized for its ability to match or surpass her previous successes. The pressure was relentless. Behind the scenes, her personal life was also under strain. Her marriage to Dennis Quaid, once considered one of Hollywood's most stable unions, was fraying under the combined pressures of fame, career demands, and rumors that never quite went away. Still, on screen, she was untouchable. She could open a movie on name recognition alone. In 1999, she was paid $15 million for You've Got Mail, one of the highest salaries for an actress at the time. She had the clout to choose her projects, the admiration of audiences worldwide, and the kind of cultural presence that few actors ever achieve. And then, in 2000, came Proof of Life. The film paired her with Russell Crowe, fresh off his Gladiator success. It was a tense thriller, far from the warm glow of her romantic comedies, and Meg saw it as an opportunity to diversify her career. But the film was overshadowed almost entirely by the off-screen story, her relationship with Crowe, and the public unraveling of her marriage to Quaid. Tabloids pounced. Overnight, the narrative shifted. The queen of romantic comedy was no longer America's sweetheart. She was cast as the villain in a Hollywood scandal. For Meg, the experience was a double blow. Professionally, Proof of Life underperformed. Personally, she found herself vilified in the press, her years of carefully built goodwill collapsing under the weight of gossip headlines. She had spent more than a decade at the top, but as the new millennium began, the cracks in her public image and her own relationship with fame were about to widen. The woman who had once defined a genre was about to face the biggest test of her career. What happens when the audience decides they no longer want the story you're telling?
In the winter of 2000, Proof of Life hit theaters. On paper, it had all the right elements. A high-stakes kidnapping thriller, a post-Gladiator Russell Crowe, and Meg Ryan stepping into a grittier, more dramatic role. But before the film could find its footing, its off-screen drama swallowed it whole. When paparazzi photos emerged of Meg and Crowe together, the media frenzy was instant. The timing was brutal. Her separation from Dennis Quaid had only just been made public, and the press had no interest in nuance. The headline was irresistible:
America's sweetheart cheats with Hollywood's bad boy. The truth, of course, was more complicated. Meg's marriage had been eroding for years, worn down by the strain of two demanding careers, and what she would later hint were repeated betrayals. But in the court of public opinion, complexity didn't matter. Almost overnight, the narrative flipped. For more than a decade, she had been the charming, relatable everywoman. Now she was painted as reckless, unfaithful, and perhaps worst of all, in the eyes of Hollywood executives, unmarketable. The fallout was swift. Studios grew cautious. The rom-com genre itself was shifting. Younger stars like Julia Roberts and Sandra Bullock were dominating the rom-coms, while Hollywood's appetite for the kind of warm, character-driven stories Meg excelled at was waning. The industry's brutal math was at work. A female star in her 40s, saddled with a tabloid scandal, in a genre that was losing box office power. The offer slowed, then stopped. She tried to pivot. There was In the Cut, 2003, a dark erotic thriller directed by Jane Campion. It was raw, unglamorous, and a deliberate attempt to shatter her rom-com image. Critics were divided. Some praised her risk-taking, others dismissed it as a mid-career identity crisis. The film's poor box office didn't help. She took other roles, supporting parts, indie projects, but none reignited her stardom. By 2004, she had virtually disappeared from the A-list. For Meg, the shift was both external and internal. In interviews during this period, she sounded increasingly disenchanted with the machinery of fame. She spoke of feeling trapped by the America's Sweetheart label, of how public perception had never really matched the private reality of her life.
In 2008, she gave a candid interview to InStyle where she broke her long silence about her divorce. For the first time, she stated outright that Dennis Quaid had been unfaithful during their marriage, long before her relationship with Crowe. It was a quiet attempt to reclaim her narrative. But by then, the cultural moment had passed. The public had moved on, and the Hollywood system had already reallocated its affections to the next generation of leading ladies. Meanwhile, the romantic comedy, once her kingdom, was in decline. The genre's budget-friendly, mid-tier productions were giving way to tent-pole franchises and superhero sagas. Netflix and streaming were still in their infancy, and there was no reliable market for the kind of heartfelt, character-first storytelling Meg had built her career on. Her absence became self-reinforcing. Without frequent releases, audiences forgot. Without audience demand, studios didn't call. And without studio offers, Meg began to question whether she wanted to be part of the game at all. By the early 2010s, she had quietly stepped away. She moved to New York, raised her adopted daughter Daisy, and explored a life outside the entertainment bubble. For someone who had once been inescapable, the disappearance was almost total. She described the period later as a form of liberation. I didn't feel like I was leaving anything. I felt like I was getting my life back. In that choice lay the paradox of Meg Ryan's career. She had reached a level of success few ever dream of, but it was walking away, not holding on, that ultimately gave her peace. Yet, the industry's memory is long, and so is the audience's curiosity. In her absence, the mythology of Meg Ryan grew. Nostalgia for the 90s rom-com era painted her as an irreplaceable icon, a reminder of a time when movie love stories were earnest and stars were truly larger than life. But to understand why she stayed away, and why she might never return in the same way, we have to look at the years in between, the exile, the reinvention, and the quiet life she built far from the sound stages of Hollywood.
When Meg Ryan stepped back from Hollywood, she didn't make a grand announcement. There was no farewell tour, no emotional goodbye interview. She simply stopped showing up where everyone expected her to be. One day, she was on every magazine cover, every late-night talk show, every romantic comedy poster. The next, she wasn't. And unlike many stars who retreat but keep a foot in the industry, appearing at events, chasing passion projects, Meg didn't seem to want even that. Her retreat was deliberate. she moved away from Los Angeles, settling in New York City's Soho neighborhood. The urban anonymity suited her. New Yorkers are famously indifferent to celebrity, and Meg could walk the streets without the constant flash of cameras. Friends recall seeing her at local cafes, shopping for groceries, or riding her bike through the city without security in tow. But the most striking chapter of her disappearance happened far from American soil. In 2007, Meg rented a modest stone house in a small village in Provence, France. There, she lived almost entirely under the radar for nearly a year. Villagers remember her as warm, polite, and private. She learned pottery from a local artisan, painted in the afternoons, and shopped at the market every morning, always choosing the freshest bread, flowers, and fruit. No one asked for autographs. Many didn't even know who she was. It wasn't just a getaway, it was a reclamation. For someone whose life had been defined by public consumption, the experience of being just Meg was intoxicating. She later described it as the most normal year I've ever had. During her time away, Meg focused on raising her daughter, Daisy, whom she adopted from China in 2006. Motherhood became her anchor, a role she could fully inhabit without the scripts, the lighting, and the watchful eyes of a global audience. She kept her social circle small, preferring the company of close friends like Nora Ephron, who remained one of her most trusted confidants until her passing in 2012. There were occasional public sightings, an appearance at a charity event, a front row seat at Paris Fashion Week, but they were rare and often unannounced. Each time, the photos sparked a wave of online nostalgia. Fans would flood social media with side-by-side shots of Meg then and now, lamenting her absence from the screen.
But Meg wasn't nostalgic in the same way. She had little interest in chasing the past. Offers did come in, scripts for romantic comedies that hoped to bottle the magic of the 90s one more time, but she turned most of them down. She'd had her run, and she didn't want to repeat herself. In 2015, she stepped behind the camera for her directorial debut, Ithaca, an adaptation of William Saroyan's novel, The Human Comedy. The project was deeply personal. It starred her old friend Tom Hanks in a cameo, and it allowed her to explore storytelling from a different angle. The film received mixed reviews and limited distribution, but for Meg, it wasn't about commercial success. It was about doing something on her own terms. In interviews during this period, she spoke with a calm that contrasted sharply with the frantic energy of her tabloid years. She admitted that fame had once been addictive, but also corrosive. "I was burned out. I didn't feel like I was missing out on anything by not being on a set. I felt like I had gotten my life back." This wasn't the bitter withdrawal of someone pushed out, it was the conscious retreat of someone who realized the cost of staying in the game. By the late 2010s, Meg's appearances had become so rare that each one was treated like a mini-event. When she attended the Governor's Awards, wearing a sleek black gown and flashing that famous smile, the internet exploded with headlines about her return. But it wasn't a return in the Hollywood sense. She was there as a guest, not as a star promoting a project. Her years away weren't about hiding, they were about living. The life she built outside the spotlight was quieter, smaller, and infinitely more her own. And for Meg Ryan, that was enough. But in the background, nostalgia for the 90s rom-com era was building into a cultural wave. Younger audiences were discovering Sleepless in Seattle and You've Got Mail on streaming platforms. Memes and TikTok edits brought her films back into the conversation. And as Hollywood began revisiting its past with reboots and sequels, the inevitable question began to resurface. Would Meg Ryan ever come back? By the mid to late 2010s, Hollywood had changed dramatically since Meg Ryan last reigned at the box office. The mid-budget romantic comedy,
the genre that had made her a household name, had nearly vanished from theaters. Superhero films, streaming giants, and franchise storytelling dominated. But something else had shifted: the audience's relationship with nostalgia. A whole new generation was discovering When Harry Met Sally, Sleepless in Seattle, and You've Got Mail on streaming services. Clips of Meg's iconic scenes were circulating on TikTok. Her name was trending again, not because of a new scandal, but because people missed the kind of films she made famous. By 2015, she decided to test the waters. Her directorial debut, Ithaca, wasn't a glossy romantic comedy. It was a quiet World War II drama based on William Saroyan's The Human Comedy. The story, about a young boy delivering telegrams to families who had lost loved ones in the war, resonated with Meg's own longing for sincerity in storytelling. She reunited briefly on screen with Tom Hanks, who appeared in a small cameo. The film had a limited release and modest reception, but for Meg, the experience was more about creative fulfillment than box office glory. In 2023, she returned in front of the camera for the romantic comedy What Happens Later, opposite David Duchovny. It was a stripped-down, two-character story set in an airport during a snowstorm, a film about timing, missed connections, and the bittersweet nature of love. Meg not only starred in it, she directed and co-wrote it. While the movie received mixed reviews, many critics acknowledged that it captured something rare: a rom-com for adults, one that embraced the passage of time instead of pretending it hadn't happened. The comeback wasn't the explosive return some fans might have imagined, but it was exactly the kind of project Meg had been waiting for, one that allowed her to control the narrative, both on screen and behind the scenes. Still, the industry had changed, and Meg's career would never operate on the same terms as before. She knew it, and she didn't seem to mind. Fame was no longer the currency she was chasing.
"I don't think of myself as retired," she said in an interview. "I just don't feel the need to be in the conversation all the time." Her legacy, however, was cementing itself without her having to lift a finger. Critics began to reevaluate her body of work, noting that the best Meg Ryan performances had aged remarkably well. Younger filmmakers cited her as an influence. Romantic comedies made in the 2020s often borrowed her blueprint: intelligent female leads, grounded emotional stakes, and humor that came from character, not gimmick. She became a living symbol of an era when love stories were sincere, when charm didn't require cynicism, and when movie stars could be both glamorous and relatable. Meg's absence even became part of her mystique. In an age of constant exposure, where celebrities document every meal and every thought on social media, her refusal to participate made her feel almost mythical. She was a reminder of the kind of movie star who doesn't need to be everywhere to be unforgettable. Privately, she kept her life simple. She divided her time between New York and occasional trips abroad, remained close to her two children, her son, Jack Quaid, who was building his own acting career, and her daughter, Daisy, and pursued creative work quietly. In a sense, her legacy wasn't just about the roles she played, but about the way she left. She didn't cling to the industry or try to contort herself to fit its shifting demands. She walked away before it could take more from her than she was willing to give. Her career was proof that Hollywood glory can be fleeting, but it can also be enough. Meg Ryan didn't have to dominate every decade to remain iconic. Sometimes disappearing at the right time is what makes a star unforgettable. Meg Ryan's career arc reads almost like one of the films she once headlined. A bright beginning, a decade of love and adoration from the public, a heartbreak, and an ending that is both unexpected and quietly triumphant. But unlike the tidy resolutions of romantic comedies, her story resists simple closure. She didn't ride off into the sunset with a box office smash. She didn't have a teary public goodbye to her fans. She simply stopped.
For many, that was the hardest part to understand. Hollywood trains audiences to expect their stars to fight for relevance, to cling to the spotlight until the light burns out. But Meg's departure was something different. It was intentional. She had seen the cost of staying in the game too long, the way the industry could turn on you overnight, the way public adoration could curdle into judgment, the way your own identity could be swallowed by the roles you played. And she decided it wasn't worth it. In stepping away, she gave herself something few in Hollywood ever find: peace. She got to be a mother without a camera lens constantly intruding. She got to live in a French village where no one cared about her opening weekend numbers. She got to create on her own terms, even if the projects weren't commercial juggernauts. Her story forces a question that's uncomfortable for the fame-obsessed culture we live in. What if success isn't about staying on top forever? What if the real victory is knowing when to leave? For Meg, the answer came quietly, without fanfare. In interviews, she has never framed her departure as an act of defiance or bitterness. Instead, she talks about it with a kind of calm acceptance.
I just wanted to live my life. That's all. That's everything. In a strange way, her disappearance has made her more enduring. In a world where celebrities are overexposed and overanalyzed, Meg Ryan remains something rare, a mystery. We know her through the films that defined a golden era of romantic comedies. But her personal story, full of choices, sacrifices, and self-preservation, belongs to her alone. Her legacy is not just When Harry Met Sally, or Sleepless in Seattle, or You've Got Mail. It's the idea that you can walk away from the machine and still keep the love of your audience. That you can define your career without letting it define you. For those who came of age in the 1990s, Meg Ryan will always be the face of cinematic love. Smiling through rainy windows, holding handwritten letters, standing in an empty park, waiting for the right person to arrive. For younger audiences discovering her now, she's proof that charm doesn't expire with time, and that authenticity can outlast any trend. In the end, the glory in her story isn't just the fame she once had. It's the quiet life she built afterward. She didn't lose it all. She chose something else. And in that choice lies a different kind of power. Meg Ryan's Hollywood chapter may be closed, but her presence lingers in every romantic comedy that dares to treat love as something worth believing in. And for millions of moviegoers, her smile, captured in those timeless films, will always be the one that could melt even the coldest winter.